Turn your Bibles to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6, and we'll read verses 30 through 34. Mark chapter 6, 30 through 34. Then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, "Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves. But the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. They arrived before them and came together to him. And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep, not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things."
Good evening, everyone. We're grateful that you're here tonight. Glad that you're back. If you're back, we're grateful for that. We're just grateful for everybody being here. I'm so glad that you guys are really pretty good to preach to. You listen well, and I appreciate it very, very much, and give good attention. I'm really excited about the fact that we've already moved one brother to repentance. Devin has repented of his willingness to only sing out of one songbook. So it's going well here so far. So we're grateful for that. So good. I mentioned this morning that maybe I'd take a minute to tell you a little bit about my family. Just so you know, most of you may know, you certainly know our extended family, the Frazier family, and related to the Kugel family. And of course, Candy is Ernie and Bertha's oldest daughter, and I've married her 41 years ago, and right outside of town here. And it's been the best thing that happened to me, except for being a Christian. Becoming a Christian, it was the best thing that happened to me, and becoming her husband was the next best thing that happened to me. And we've had 41 years almost of great marriage. We've been blessed with 3 children. We have a daughter named Renee, and she's in her mid-30s, upper 30s, I guess. And she's married to a young man named Matthew. He is a medical laboratory scientist for one of the hospitals in Peoria. They live right there in Peoria with their 3 daughters and worship with us at Paris Avenue where we preach. So we're good about that. Our second child is a son. His name is Joshua. He's married to Stephanie, and they have 2 children, and they live about 40 minutes from us in a little town called Canton, where Joshua has been preaching for the last 10 or 12 years. It's his first preaching work, and he's doing a good work there. And so they're just 40 minutes from us. And then our youngest son, his name is Caleb, and he's married to a little lady named Sarah, and together they have 4 children, two girls and 2 boys, 5 and under. They said they planned it that way, but I don't know. But anyway, but we're thankful for that. Caleb is a donor rep for the Red Cross. He plans these kind of blood donation drives and that sort of thing. And so we're really happy. He and his wife, of course, also worship with us at Paris Avenue. So we feel, a preacher and his wife, we feel like we're living in a tub of butter, because preachers don't typically have their family that close to them. And we're just thrilled that our kids are that close. We're able to see them regularly. And so that's a great thrill for us. And that means we get to see our 9 grandchildren regularly. So we are thankful for that. We're grateful for our family. God has been good to us. My family has been very good to me. They've followed me to preach in a lot of places, and I appreciate their goodness, and the fact that they've all turned out well and have married well is testimony to the goodness of God and a wonderful mother. So grateful for them, and grateful for Candy. And been working with the church in Peoria for the last 16 years, I guess, nearly 17 years. Before that, we were in Rockford, Illinois, which is north of there. We were there for a time that spanned about 20 years. But in the middle of that time, we went to Eastern Europe to a country called Slovakia, started to work there in Bratislava, Slovakia. And we were there with some very dear friends of ours, David and Robin Disselkamp. I don't know if you've heard the Disselkamp name. Leslie Disselkamp was the grandfather of that family, and he's gone on to be with the Lord. But David is one of his grandsons, and my best friend, Robin, is Candy's best friend, and We actually lived together in the same house for 4.5 years and with our children, and worked in preaching the gospel together. And David is a man who I love, and he is my close friend, and we've done some work together in other places like Sierra Leone, West Africa. It's good to have a friend as close as David. So we feel like we've been blessed. That gives you a little bit of a backdrop on us. If I've bored you, okay, sorry. But I enjoyed telling it, okay? We used to have an elder in a congregation up in Rockford who he was really good about telling stories, and he would tell these stories. And of course, I'd known him for years. And so I'd heard so many of his stories, almost all of his stories over and over again. And he would be talking to somebody and says, I'm going to tell you a story, start telling stories. He says, now, if I've told you this story before, don't stop me. I want to hear it again. So I wanted to hear about how my family is so nice. Anyway, thank you for tolerating that. I want you to open your Bible to Mark chapter 6, the passage that Luke read for us just a moment ago. Appreciate his doing that for us. And by the way, we just enjoyed worshiping with you so much. Like I said, you're very attentive to the preaching, but I see the worship that seems to come from you in terms of your singing and your praying. A very diligent prayer that we had, and all the prayers have been good. The song leading has been really good. The singing has been great, and it's been very difficult for me because I've not been singing, trying to save my voice to preach. I think if I can get through tonight, maybe tomorrow night I can actually join you in the singing. But it's very hard to sit there and hear such good singing and be inspired by it and not able to sing yourself. It's kind of frustrating. But I really appreciate y'all's the good what seems to be a really good church here, and I appreciate so much your worship because we're worshiping a God who deserves to be worshiped. He deserves our adoration, our praise, and I appreciate the way in which you approach that. It seems to be very encouraging to me, at least. So thank you for that. So Mark chapter 6, if you'll open to Mark chapter 6. In this context, Jesus had sent the 12 apostles out on what sometimes we call the limited commission, in contrast to the Great Commission that's recorded at the end of Matthew and Mark. And so this is where he sends the disciples out with just kind of a limited commission to do some preaching. And when they returned to Jesus in chapter 6 and verse 30, they reported to him about all that they had done and taught, the work that they had done. And Jesus realized that these guys had been working hard, saw their need for rest. And so he took them by boat away from the crowds to a secluded place in order that they might hopefully get some rest for a while. But according to verse 33, the crowds of people saw Jesus and the 12 leaving, and so they ran ahead kind of around the seashore, and they met Jesus on the other side. And when Jesus came ashore, Matthew chapter 6 and verse 34, he saw this large crowd of people, and they seemed to him to be like sheep without a shepherd. That's what the text says in verse 34. Now, I draw your attention to this occasion, and we're really focusing on this occasion, but there's actually another occasion, a different occasion, in which Jesus sees a group of people in a very similar way. I know it's a different occasion. It's in Matthew chapter 9. Sorry, not Mark 9, but Matthew chapter 9. And it's actually an event that takes place before Jesus sends out the apostles on the limited commission. And on this occasion, Jesus again sees a crowd, and he sees them as sheep without a shepherd. But there are a couple of other words that are used to describe this group of people if you look at Matthew's account. Jesus was going through all the cities in verse 35 and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. And seeing the people, he felt compassion for them because they were distressed and dispirited like sheep without a shepherd. And Jesus said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore beseech the Lord of harvest to send out workers into his harvest." So this is a different occasion, but what I want you to see then is that we have at least two occasions in which Jesus saw people, and his perception of them is that they were like sheep without a shepherd. Matthew gives us a couple of other adjectives to describe them. He says that they were, what does he use the word? He says that they were distressed and dispirited. Now these words are used elsewhere in our New Testament. They give us a little bit of an idea of what they're like. The first word that is translated distressed, I think the King James Version uses the word faint. This is a word that describes a weak or limp condition. It's actually the antonym of it, the opposite of it, is a word that's used in 1 Peter 1 and verse 13. If you were reading an older version, you would read about in 1 Peter 1 and verse 13 about how they were to gird up their loins for action. And the word that is translated gird in that verse, I think in the New American Standard it says prepare your minds for action. But the word that is translated gird is taken from a picture of something that would have happened in the first century world. And that is that when men would go out into the fields, they wore these longer robes, not like we wear pants. They didn't wear pants, they wore robes. And so when they got out into the fields and they were going to work somehow, they would reach down between their legs and they'd grab the back side of their robe and they'd pull it all the way up and they'd tuck it in their belt and they'd cinch up their belt, and that way they would get control of their garments so that they could work. Well, that idea of cinching up your belt is the antonym of the word that's used here. So instead of being tightened up, this is a word that has to do with the idea of being loosened up. And so the point is that they were distressed, and it's a word that sort of describes the idea of being limp and just, loose and kind of worn out and weary. In fact, it's translated in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9. It's translated by the word weary. And so when the text, Matthew describes the people that Jesus sees, not only are they like sheep without a shepherd, they are people who are just worn out weary. Okay? Not only that, they're people who are distressed. And, not distressed, the word dispirited is used in the New American Standard Version, or downcast. And it's kind of a violent word. It's used in a very literal sense in Acts chapter 22 and verse 23 when the Jews had been listening to Paul preach on the steps as they had tried to mob him and kill him. And he was kind of saved by the Roman centurion there in the fortress of Antonia overlooking the temple in Jerusalem. And they brings him up on the steps and he preaches to them a while, and they get so mad at him at some point that they finally just quit listening to him, and they throw dust in there and they take their coats off and they throw them down, and they're just in a conniption fit. And that word where they throw their coats down is this word. And it's like the idea of somebody who's just been violently tossed aside. And so the idea here then is that we've got these people that Jesus sees, and he sees them in this terrible condition. He sees these people as worn out and weary, as being thrown down. They're give out, and they're also like sheep without a shepherd. And of course, sheep without a shepherd, it's not a good situation to be in, because that's a lost sort of situation to be in. Now, sheep oftentimes are lost. They wander away from the shepherd without, they just kind of aimlessly wander away in dangerous places because they're careless or whatever. At first, they may be totally oblivious to the fact that they have wandered away from the shepherd. Part of the sheep just kind of wander away from the rest of the flock and the shepherd. And in a little while, as they wander further, they begin to get beaten by the various kinds of foliage and brush and that sort of thing that they come in contact with, and they end up worn out. Maybe they end up with their legs scratched and cut and burrs in their wool and that sort of thing, and they just become weak and whipped and worn out. And in this weary, worn, and whipped condition, with no shepherd, they are lost, hopelessly lost. And that's the condition of the people that Jesus sees on this occasion. When he looked at on these two occasions, he sees these people, and that's what they look like. They look like they're just worn out, broken people who are lost without anyone to guide them. And I will suggest to you that that's exactly the way all men are today. That the world today is full of people just like that. Romans 3 and verse 23 says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So everybody is to one degree or another in that kind of condition. The world is full of people who are in this kind of broken down, lost condition. They're beaten. They're broken. They're just messed up. And they're messed up with sin. And they're like sheep without a shepherd. They're in this hopelessly lost situation. That's the way our world is. That's the way people in our world are. Why are people in this condition? Why is it that that's the state that they're in? Well, someone says, well, maybe it's because they're victims. They've been victimized. And I will grant you that we live in an awful and ugly world in which sometimes the most unthinkable things happen to people. Sometimes young people, children, who are abused and brutalized and mistreated and then grow up messed up because of what happened to them. And that's a hard situation for them. But oftentimes people, even who are victimized, allow themselves to give in to the victimization. And they just sort of continue it, and they live a whole life of it being victimized. But the vast majority of our world are not victims that have just been abused and mistreated by others. In fact, many times the victimized, those who've been victimized, end up victimizing others. The reality is that most people are in their lost condition simply because they're either ignorant of God's will, willfully ignorant of God's will. They have ignored God and ignored the evidence about them that should point them to God. Or they've just rebelliously walked off and left God. Some men have grown up in a context in which they have not known God at all. And yet they have lived in a world that should be pointing them to God, but they ignore that and they just wander into sin and they get more and more involved in sin and they get deeper in it and they get broken and more broken and messed up. Some men have the advantage of having people who taught them about God to one degree or another. Maybe not correctly about God, but one way or another they've learned something about God, but they just have rebelled. They just didn't want to listen. And the result is that they're broken. So, some are lost because they're ignorant. Some are lost because they're arrogant and rebellious. But no matter what the reason, they end up in this situation where they are without a shepherd. They're cut off from any shepherd. And they are broken in sin. That's the way these crowds were that Jesus saw. And it's still the way people are today. They're broken and lost. And that's even the case in the Lord's church. You need to understand that we're not called to Christ because we are paragons of righteousness. And because, we're okay and are called simply in order to serve as examples to others who might need to make changes, who need to emulate our righteousness. That's not why we're called. We're called precisely because we're not okay. Because we're broken. Messed up in sin. And that's the way it was for me. I'll be honest with you and tell you that I was messed up. Young man at the age of 20, on November 19th, 1978, when I finally broke down my will and obeyed the gospel. I had parents who were Christians. My dad's a preacher, but me and my two brothers, we were in a situation where we thought, preachers' kids are a bunch of sissies. And we wanted to prove that preachers' kids didn't have to be that way. And we all three walked on the wild side for a while. I walked on the wild side pretty badly. And I was selfish and self-willed, and I had no self-control. I was working on having a real drinking problem. My passion was in control of me, and I wasn't going anywhere in a good place fast. I had a friend. His name is B.B. Israel, and B.B. took an interest in me and tried to help me see my need for the gospel of Christ. One of the things he did sort of He sort of put the fear of hell in me. I think that some guys can be appealed to by the gospel and the tender message of Christ who dies for them, but some of us, God has to get their attention, and God used BB to get my attention. So when I became a Christian, I was broken. I was messed up, and I had issues, and I still have issues, okay? 40 years down the road, 42 years down the road, and he's still working on me. He's still trying to make me a better man. I'm still trying to be more conformed to the image of Christ. I still have, to this day, some of those ugly things that were in the past that sometimes raise their ugly head and try to confront me still, and I have to fight them off and ward them off because some of those things just kind of stick with you. And that's the way it is for most people. I'm not telling you something, okay, you might have been a little more decent person, I don't know, but all of us, when we become Christians, we're lost. When we finally realize our need for the gospel, if we're genuine people, we recognize how broken we are. And so what I'm saying is that when we convert people to Christ even, we convert people out of a broken world. And they're broken themselves. And so it shouldn't be a surprise to us that people come to Christ with baggage. And we're going to have to try to help those people with that baggage. And they need some kind of help because they're broken. And here was this one who had no flaw, no fault, never done a thing in the world wrong, only followed his Father's will completely. And he looked at this people who were broken in sin because of their own stupidity, because of their own ignorance, because of their own rebellion. And he looked at them and he saw them as sheep without a shepherd. So that's what Jesus saw. When he got off that boat and went ashore and saw this crowd of people approaching him, what he saw were a bunch of broken, worn out people who were lost and messed up and had no one to guide them. That's what Jesus saw. What I want to ask you next to think about from the text, though, is not just what Jesus saw. I want you to think about how Jesus felt about it. When Jesus saw this crowd, how did he feel about them? Well, he wasn't disgusted. He didn't look at them with disgust and disdain, somewhat like maybe, you remember Simon who had Jesus in his house, and that sinner woman came in and started washing Jesus' feet, and he looked at him and said in Luke chapter 7, if this guy was really a prophet, he would know that this is a sinner woman who's washing his feet. And usually that expression, the sinner, usually described, especially when applied to a woman, probably meant that she was a very loose woman, had been a very loose woman. And so he looked at her with disgust, self-righteous disgust in some ways. But that's not the way what Jesus saw this people. When he saw these people who were messed up every bit as bad as that woman, he didn't get disgusted with them. No matter, even though they were in this condition from their own stupidity and their own rebellion, he didn't get disgusted with them. He wasn't upset or angry at them. He didn't even feel righteous indignation at them as that self-righteous Pharisee did when he saw the publican praying next to him in Luke chapter 18 and verse 11, and he looked down and said, I thank God I'm not like that guy. Jesus didn't look at these people in some sort of self-righteous indignation that he was upset with them because, after all, it's their fault. They're broken, sure, but they did it to themselves, It wouldn't maybe surprise us to find someone responding to people like that from the perspective of they've done it to themselves, I'm disgusted with it, or I'm put out with them, You ever found yourself feeling that way about somebody? Somebody who was blowing it over and over again? So Jesus wasn't disgusted. He wasn't He wasn't upset or angry with them. He didn't feel even righteous indignation against them. He wasn't ambivalent or indifferent like the priest and the Levite were, for example, in our story this morning, who saw the man who had been beaten by the robbers, and they just kind of turned their face and passed by on the other side. He wasn't unconcerned about them like those men were unconcerned about the Samaritan. He wasn't disinterested in their situation. He certainly wasn't indifferent to their plight. And he could have been. Again, he could have said, it's their problem. It's their problem. That's not my problem. Jesus didn't feel any of those kinds of things. You see what the text says about how Jesus felt about it? The text says that when Jesus went ashore and saw a large crowd, he felt compassion for them, for they were like sheep without a shepherd. He felt compassion for them, pity. And in fact, that's exactly what Matthew's account says about that other occasion when Jesus saw a very similar crowd. The text says in Mark 9 and verse 36, seeing the people, he felt compassion for them. And so not just on one occasion, but on more than one occasion, when Jesus saw people who were broken and messed up by their sin, he felt pity, compassion for them. Same emotion. And I want you to notice carefully what the text says, that the text says that he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Because of their condition. It was precisely because of their condition that Jesus felt this way about it. Regardless of how they got into the mess that they were in, this broken, lost condition that they were in, regardless of how they got there, Jesus still felt compassion for them. He felt compassion because of their situation, because of the circumstances that they were facing. But they did it to themselves. I know. He still felt compassion for them. And I would suggest to you, here's the hard part of this lesson, folks. I would suggest to you that is the emotion that should be stirred in us when we see people who are in sad situation of being broken in sin. If we want to look like our Lord, if we want to be like our Lord, then the emotion that ought to be evoked when we see people broken in sin, you see a prostitute on the street, you see a drug addict in a gutter or a drunk on the side of the road, or you see some gambler who's lost his home, or you see some person who's lazy and won't work, and they're just in a terrible condition. If I want to be like Jesus, I need to see them with compassion. I don't need to see them with disgust. Disgust is not what should come to me. Impatience is not what should be the emotion stirred. Not despair, and certainly not indignation, not righteous, not even righteous indignation, especially not indifference. Those ought not to be what comes to my mind. Those are not what emotion ought to be stirred by these things. If I want to be like Jesus, then when I see people broken in sin, I ought to feel compassion for them. But it's their fault. They did it to themselves. They don't listen. We tried to help them, but they won't listen. They keep making the same bad choices. And that may well be the case, but it doesn't matter. They still need our compassion and mercy. And that's especially true of our brethren, our young, weak brothers who come with baggage and who are trying to change their lives to look more like Jesus, but they're not doing very well at it, and they keep making the same mistakes over and over again. We need to feel compassion. And I believe that if we felt more for broken men like Jesus did, if we felt more compassion than the emotions that typically are stirred in us, maybe we would reach out and help more people than we do. I wish I could tell you that when I look at people who are broken in sin, that the first emotion that comes to my heart is pity. But it's not always. Sometimes it is disgust. Sometimes, I don't know about indignation, sometimes I get angry with people who keep making the same mistakes over and over again. Frustration. Sometimes I look at it with indifference. And when that happens, I'm not like my Lord. And I don't want that. I don't want to be that way. We live in a world where people are messed up. And we need to understand that we want to help these people. And let me tell you why we want to help these people, why we want to help these people. Because we were there once. We were just exactly where they are once. Let me tell you something. If you don't think of yourself before you were a Christian as being that kind of broken person, I'm not certain you ever really got a good look at yourself. Because maybe in contrast to someone else, you weren't as broken as someone else. But in comparison to the Master, you're broken. And yet, He had mercy on us. He extended mercy to us. And the only reason you and I can be here today, the only reason we're able to be in this building and offer up this worship that we offer up with the confidence that we do and with the joy that we have in our heart is because He was merciful to us. He forgave us when we were messed up and broken. And we're still messed up. We're still in the process of being renovated into the image of Christ, as the Colossian letter puts it in Colossians chapter 3. Being renewed to be conformed to the image of Christ. We're still in that process. He's still working on us. We still ourselves have changes to make. We may be further down the road toward being fully renovated and more like Jesus than someone else, but we're still in the process. We're not there yet. We don't look like Him yet. I want to look like Him, but I don't. Not always. And it's the very fact that we ourselves have been extended mercy to that ought to cause us to want to help people like that who are broken in sin. Instead, sometimes we look at people with that kind of disgust, or at least the indifference. Let me tell you something about myself, about something that I used to do that I thought was pretty cute. And if you're struggling with the problem that I'm about to describe, please understand that I try to look at things differently now. But I struggle with a man who will beat his wife. I struggle to understand how you can do that. Candy is precious to me. And we've not always gotten along. We've had our differences in our marriage. Our kids will tell you that we didn't yell at each other, really. At least where they could hear it. We would always go to our room and they could tell Mom and Dad are having a discussion. But I've never raised a hand to her. I just don't understand how that can happen. And I used to say, because I can't understand how a man can do that to his wife, I used to say, it's obvious that I didn't write the Bible. Because if I'd written the Bible, I would have put in there that the man who beats his wife, the brethren can take him out behind the woodshed and adjust his attitude with a big stick. And if I had written the Bible furthermore, I would have put in there that the preacher gets to take the first licks. And I used to think that was pretty cute. And had a brother, one time I did that, and I had a brother come up to me afterwards, and he said to me, he said, Rick, let me ask you a question. He said, what if I was a guy who was beating my wife, who would lose my temper with my wife, and I would just, haul off and hit her? And I loathed myself when I did it. After I did it, I got a hold of my temper. I would be so penitent, and I would go back and I would beg her to forgive me, and I would say I was so sorry. But I just was struggling to control my temper. And so often it would just get the better of me, and I would break out and hit my wife. I got to have some help with overcoming this problem. And suddenly he thinks about Rick Ligon. Oh, Rick Ligon. He's a guy who seems to be pretty understanding. Maybe he can help me to overcome my problem with losing my temper and hitting my wife. Maybe he can help me. After service, I'm going to go to services tonight, and after services, I'm going to ask Rick if he would help me get a control of my anger and help me to overcome my problem. And so he comes to services, and it just happens to be on that particular night that I get up and I, in my preaching, use that cute little illustration. And then the brother looked at me when he said that, painted that picture for me, and he looked at me and he said, do you think that guy is going to want to come talk to you now? After he knows how you feel about the preacher getting to take the first licks? Do you think he's going to want to listen to you now? And suddenly I realized that I was slamming the door on men I didn't know. Maybe there were men who were in that very situation, that because I didn't respond like my Lord to, that I didn't allow myself to be moved with compassion. Okay, it's a bad thing to beat your wife, but maybe we can help you overcome this. Because I didn't meet it with the kind of Christ-like attitude, I slammed the door on some people maybe who didn't get help. We're dealing with some problems in the church that have been problems. Some of them have been problems around for several years now. Internet is a wonderful thing, and it allows us to do a lot of things with computers, and I love the fact that we can do a lot of things with computers nowadays. But I tell you, I noticed an explosion of problems with pornography when I came back from Slovakia years ago, in 97. Because by that time, I had my first computer. I took my first computer with me to Slovakia in 1993. It was my first computer. While we were in Slovakia, we learned about something called email. And and it was that dial-up email thing. But when we got back to the States, it was internet stuff. And internet suddenly made pornography accessible just so easy to everybody. And we're struggling with that in the church. There's very few preacher brothers that I know of that are not working with someone as some kind of an accountability partner. I'm an accountability partner for several fellows right now still. I get texts on my phone from certain people just because I'm hooked up to them with some kind of accountability program, and I get informed if they look at something on the internet that's questionable. And I am able to look at that and talk to them if I realize it's something they shouldn't be on. And that's because we got guys that we're truly who want desperately to overcome this problem of pornography. And we've got to try to help them. But if we're disgusted with them because they're letting themselves get caught up in that, how much do you think we're going to help them? Let me tell you about another situation that is uncomfortable to talk about, but if you'd have told me 20 years ago that I would one day be considered an immoral bigot because I opposed same-sex relations, I would say that's not going to happen, but it's happening. if you'd have told me 20 years ago that 20 years from now you're going to be dealing with, maybe earlier than 20 years from now, actually it would be, you're going to be dealing with young men in the church, Christians, who are struggling with same-sex attraction, I would say that would never go happen in the church. But it's a problem. I have unsuccessfully tried to help 3 or 4 young men who approached me about help with that. I've tried to help them. Unfortunately, most of the ones I've been involved with that have been long-distance relationships, so I wasn't able to really be closely involved with them, on a day-to-day basis. And so they've all, unfortunately, slipped away into homosexual lifestyle, and Christian men who are Christians. And I'm terrified about it, saddened about that. I have to be careful about the way I talk to them. I have to be careful about the way I talk about this issue, because I don't want to, as much as I oppose homosexuality, let me tell you this, I'm just going to make this very clear. I'm just as much opposed to heterosexual relations outside of marriage or adulterous relationships as I am same-sex relationships, okay? We sort of made a mess of things when we started wanting to, we wonder why we have a problem with same-sex relations, and that's a problem. Listen, we lost that battle years ago. We talk about the sanctity of marriage, We lost that battle a long time ago when we started letting our young people live with their girlfriend or boyfriend, and we started allowing adultery and remarriage, divorce and remarriage in the church. That's unscriptural divorce and remarriage. That's when we opened the door to, it's amazing to me years ago when there was a lady in Kentucky, I think somewhere, who worked with some sort of city clerk's office or something, who issued marital licenses, and she was unwilling to issue a marriage license to a same-sex couple. And when you investigate further, you find out that this woman is on her 3rd marriage. Who is she to oppose same-sex sin? She's involved in sexual sin herself, you see. And so my point is, I'm opposed to same-sex relations, as opposed as I am to other sexual relations outside of marriage. But we've got people who are really struggling with that, who don't want to go down that road, who don't want to get caught up in that lifestyle, who are fighting that temptation. And if I appear to be disgusted with them, or I appear to be indignant with them, I am probably not going to be able to help them. And so I don't care how disgusted you are. I understand that certain sins are more loathsome to me, okay? I don't struggle at all with same-sex attraction. I don't understand the appeal. It doesn't seem reasonable to me. But I know that there's some people who struggle with that. I got a good friend who struggles with gambling. I don't understand the appeal to that, okay? But I know he would be tempted by that. You may not wonder why I would be tempted with alcohol years ago, but I was. Okay? The point is, just because I don't understand why this person is attracted to this sinful lifestyle or is being tempted by this, I still need to love him and care about him and be merciful to him and try to have pity on him and try to do something to help him. And if my response to him when he comes to me with his problem is to be disgusted with him, or to be indignant with him, or to just be indifferent. One of the young men that I talked to, in fact, the very first guy I ever tried to talk to about same-sex attraction, I asked him if he had talked to his elders about the problem. And he said, yes, he went to his elders and they told him to read your Bible more and pray more. And then that was the end of their involvement. And that was because they were just unprepared to deal with that. And I'm not saying that I'm prepared to help somebody with it, but I desperately want to find a way. Because if somebody's caught up in this sin, they're going to be lost, eternally lost. And my Lord bled and died so that that wouldn't happen to that guy. And so my point is that when we look at people and we see that they're lost, Jesus saw a group of lost people. They were lost because of their own stupidity and ignorance and rebellion and arrogance. But he wasn't disgusted with them. He wasn't indignant with them, and he wasn't indifferent to their plight. He looked at them, and the emotion that it evoked was pity, mercy, compassion. So what did Jesus see? He saw people like sheep without a shepherd, lost. How did he feel about them? He felt compassion for them. What did he do about it? Well, I want you to notice what the text says, and it's really rather simple. It says that he saw them as sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. What I want you to understand is that the solution to the problem of sin is teaching, instruction, helping people understand God's will. Notice that Jesus didn't throw up his hands in despair. What's the use? This is a lost cause. They won't listen. I can remember a guy that we converted in Rockford, Illinois, and he didn't continue as a Christian, unfortunately. Oh, he was in Peoria, Illinois. Sorry. Lose track of where things happen, what happen when you get old. And I would get out of breath just thinking about how much work it was going to be just to keep this guy faithful. I mean, he had a lot of issues. Jesus didn't get disgusted or, give up or throw up his hands in despair. He didn't try to boss them around or order them around in some sort of way. He didn't try some sort of heavy-handed approach to them, scold them and mock them and tell them, you start to straighten up, man. He didn't say to them, I told you so. I told you that if you started doing those kinds of things, you'd have these kind of problems. No, Jesus began to teach them many things. Teaching is the solution. Teaching was their only hope. What they needed was patient instruction. Notice that Jesus did not offer them validation of their sin. He didn't validate their sin. He didn't say, oh, it's okay, don't worry about it. He taught them what they needed to know and let them choose to follow it or not. But he appealed to them with teaching. And that is what we have to do when we find people who are overcome. When we find people who are broken and downcast men, what they need is they need someone who will teach them many things. When we turn to 1 Timothy chapter 2, or 1 Timothy, not 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul says, I solemnly charge you in the presence of God and Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead by his appearing in kingdom. Preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with great patience and instruction. I remember when I was serving as an elder once in Peoria, the other elder that was with me, we would have situations come up and he would say, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? How are we going to handle this? And I would say, we're going to teach them many things. We're going to teach them patiently. We're going to patiently instruct them. That's what we do. That's what they need. And that's what will help them. If anything is going to help them, compassionate teaching, patient teaching is what's going to help people. So what did Jesus see? He saw a crowd of people who were like sheep without a shepherd, broken, messed up people. How did he feel about it? He felt compassion. And that compassion then moved him to do something about it. And what he did was he taught them many things. He taught them what they needed to hear. And I want to suggest to you that that needs to start becoming our response when we see people who are broken in sin. That needs to be our response when we have brethren who are struggling. They need our compassion and they need our instruction from the Word of God to help them to make the right choices and to do the right things and to overcome their problem. I want to close by looking at, in Matthew's account of this text, Jesus said something about, after he saw them as sheep without a shepherd, he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore beseech the Lord of harvest to send out workers into the harvest." Jesus is saying essentially the same thing. We've got all these broken people. This is a harvest that needs to be gathered. We need to get out there and have workers who are out there trying to teach these people the things that they need to hear. There's another occasion on what we call a different kind of, it's where Jesus sent out the 70. It's a little bit of a different circumstance, but it's in Luke the 10th chapter. Luke the 10th chapter, and in first couple of verses there. This is when Jesus sends out the 70. It's very similar, but I want to notice something with you from this text. "Now after this, the Lord appointed 70 others and sent them in pairs ahead of him to every city and place where he himself was going to come. And he was saying to them, 'The harvest is plentiful, the laborers are few, therefore beseech the Lord of harvest to send out laborers into the harvest.'" Let me tell you something all of us can do as we look at a broken world that's overcome with sin, lost like sheep without a shepherd. Here's something we can do, or we can all do. We can pray about God sending out workers to teach those people. But here's where it gets personal, okay? It's interesting to me that Jesus says to these guys, "Therefore beseech the Lord of harvest to send out laborers and go into the harvest." Laborers into the harvest. And then the next word is go. You understand what Jesus is saying to these guys? He's saying, pray for workers to go into the harvest. Now you go. After you've prayed for workers to go, you be one of those. And that's what we need to do. We need to pray for people who will reach out to folks who are lost and in sin. And then we need to be one of those guys who helps fulfill our own prayer by going ourselves. I've gone a little overtime tonight. It's probably because I told you about my family, but I'm sorry about that. Thank you very much for listening tonight. Thank you for your patience as we've tried to listen to these things. I'm very passionate about this stuff because this is important stuff. This is what has become our mission, is to be conformed ourselves to the image of Christ and to be a blessing in the lives of people who need the same thing that we have had in terms of the mercy of Christ being extended to us. Let's do that. Let's do it in a way that's going to be effective. If you're here tonight and you're broken and there's something you need help with, this group of people loves you. This group of people cares about you. This group of people is a group of people who have been where you've been, where you are, who know what it's like to be lost. This group of people know that, and they want to help you. And if we can somehow help you, we encourage you to come while we stand and sing with Devin.